So SEBI launched the overall Ideathon program earlier this year in a partnership with BSE, NSC, NSDL, CDSL, KFintech, CAMS, LinkedIn Time, MCX, and NCDEX. And the overall agenda for this, the program is how can we generate innovation in capital market and through ideas itself from the open market. And these are the 4 areas where a participant can come and submit their ideas from an investor protection and ease of investing standpoint, from securities market development to the market regulations and integration within the financial regulations. In terms of the what's in it for the participant, here are the brief takeaways for the participants. There are prizes worth up to 5 lakhs in cash up for grab, followed by exclusive goodies as well as participation certificates for all the applicants. In terms of the timelines, we are already on the 3rd masterclass today, and make sure that if you are already submitting your ideas before 14th of May, that is the end date. In terms of who should apply, if you are a startup, a finance enthusiast, a management candidate, a professional, or a student who has a relevant idea across innovation within capital and the securities market, then we would like to listen to you. We would like to know your ideas in terms of how we can innovate better within the capital markets frameworks. With that, I'd like to give a brief introduction about the today's agenda. We have distinguished speakers from various organizations. This is the brief agenda. And with that, I would like to welcome our first speaker for the day, Ms. Janjri Jasani, who is the Deputy Director at the Center for Environmental Research and Education. Ms. Janjri loves to hang out with a pet beagle, Lenny, and who also watches educational YouTube videos on science, physics, and astronomy. She is an avid traveler and adventurer and has been certified as an open water diver as well. Ms. Janjri graduated from the University of Edinburgh with an MSc in Environmental Protection and Management and is currently the Deputy Director of Center for Environmental Research and Education. Her interests are around climate change, science, sustainability development, urban solutions, and environmental issues. She has over 10 years of experience in the field of GHG accounting and has worked with several companies and institutions on carbon reporting strategy. She has interest around environmental education systems and has always been played an active role in facilitating solutions to the local and the global environmental issues itself. With that, I would like to formally hand over the mic to Ms. Janjri, to take ahead the session on climate action for businesses, GHG accounting as part of the ESG, and the role for technology in mitigating it.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you everyone for joining this session. I hope it's really useful. It's a really mixed audience, so I've tried to make the session as clear and precise as possible, but some of it may be repetitive, some people here, and some of it will be very new for others. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. I'm also going to start sharing my screen now so we can get the presentation started. And if you can just confirm for me that you can see my screen, that would be very helpful.
Yes, we can see your presentation.
Lovely, great. Okay, so let me get started for now. Okay, so good morning, everyone, and thank you again for taking the time out to sit in on this presentation. My name is Janjri Jasani. I'm the Deputy Director for Center for Environmental Research and Education. We are an environmental nonprofit working in the space of climate change and sustainability, and a lot of the work we do is with businesses and how to help them transition their businesses to greener, more efficient, climate-friendly businesses, essentially. So my talk today is on climate action for business, and I'm going to predominantly be focusing on something that SEBI has now started to take really an active role in promoting, and that is GHG accounting, and also how businesses can help mitigate and be a part of the solution when it comes to climate change. If you have any questions, I think maybe leave them till the end and I'll just go through the presentation. It should take about 25 minutes. And then we have 10 minutes, I believe, on Q&A. So I think any conversation on climate change really needs to start with the science. And this is because not all of us are on the same page when it comes to what climate change is, what global warming is. So I do want to start with a sort of brief introduction on that. So everyone is on the same page, because this can be a new topic for a lot of people. So when we talk about climate change, we are talking about the effects of the greenhouse gas effect, which is basically a phenomenon that has been happening now for maybe since the start of the Industrial Revolution. What we've been seeing is human activities have caused an increase in greenhouse gases. These are gases, some of you will be familiar. The most common one is carbon dioxide. So greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide have been put into the Earth's atmosphere. This is causing an effect called global warming, simply because carbon dioxide increases the amount of heat captured from the sun. And this increased warming is adding energy into Earth's natural systems, impacting the overall global climate, and resulting in a number of different outcomes. Everything from, of course, rising temperatures, which I think today sitting in Mumbai, I think we're all familiar with, going to severe weather events like floods and droughts, and even other issues like sea level rise, which all then have knock-on effects. So this is the sort of science of climate change in a nutshell. We talked about how greenhouse gases are increasing. So I just wanted to briefly also touch upon what those greenhouse gases are. Because if you want to do accounting for climate change for your business, you do need to sort of know this information. The most common greenhouse gas, the one I think everybody is familiar with, is carbon dioxide, but there are several others that people need to report on when you're doing greenhouse gas accounting. So I've described some of them here. Carbon dioxide is the most common, but there's also methane or CH4, nitrous oxide or N2O. There are HFCs and HCFCs or hydrofluorocarbons and hydrocarbons, which you would find in your refrigerating or HVAC systems. There's PFCs, and then there's also SF6, which are less common and are specific to certain industries only. When you're doing your greenhouse gas accounting or your carbon footprint assessment, you do need to account for all of these different types of greenhouse gases. And they're not all the same. So while climate change, while carbon dioxide has a global warming impact of 1, in comparison, the global warming impact of methane is about 28 times higher. And these multiplication factors for different greenhouse gases are called global warming potentials, or GWPs. And it's important to account for them when you're doing your assessments. So that's a little bit about the science. But why is it that this is such an important topic? Yes, climate change is happening. Yes, we are seeing extreme impacts on weather, and that has knock-on effects, but it doesn't just stop there. Climate change actually poses a serious risk to businesses and economies worldwide. And there's multiple reasons for that, right? So I want to go through some of the reasons why climate change is such a big risk for businesses. So to start with, climate change causes an impact on natural ecosystems, and that then therefore goes ahead and impacts natural resources that we all use. CERE, my organization, was working with a tire manufacturer a few years ago, and they talked about how excessive flooding in Indonesia, which is one of the prime sources of their raw material rubber, had destroyed rubber plantations, leading to a shortage in this availability of natural rubber, leading to a price rise in the cost of rubber, all of which then impacted their business here in India. So this is how interconnected climate change is really with businesses. The other two big impacts are the physical risks of climate change to the business itself. So like we discussed, climate change causes sea level rise, it causes flooding. I think we've all experienced this across India, and these events are only getting more frequent and more severe. And these impacts, physical impacts, have impacts on physical infrastructure. So our buildings, our roads, all of them can be impacted. And not only that, our staff are also impacted and their working hours. How difficult is it for people right now, maybe in Delhi or Ahmedabad, with the temperature reaching between 40 and 50 degrees Celsius, to commute to work every day? How does it impact their productivity? All of these things are things that businesses need to start thinking about, and how climate change will impact them. There's also potential changes in legislation that could lead to businesses not being in compliance with environmental laws as they evolve, because all countries now are starting to make legislation to start planning for climate change. And similarly, governments are also making changes in policies and regulation that businesses now need to be in compliance with and need to be prepared for. And again, the incredibly progressive step taken by SEBI to make climate disclosures mandatory as part of BRSR reporting is just one of those examples, right? So companies need to start preparing for these kind of disclosures. And then finally, people are starting to look for businesses to be more sustainable, to take more responsibility for the impact that they have. And so there's definitely a reputational risk involved as well if you are not managing your environmental footprint, or if you are not addressing your climate impact. So this is why it's really climate change is becoming this core issue, which 30 years ago, businesses would have said, oh, that's the problem of environmentalists. Let them handle it. And then 20 years ago or 10 years ago, it was, oh, it's a problem of environmentalists and governments. But today, it very much is something that businesses need to start integrating into every aspect of their operations and their planning. And just to sort of give you a sort of bigger picture in terms of how climate change affects the economy. So obviously, by affecting businesses, by affecting natural resources, there are larger economic impacts that one needs to consider. And the most recent IPCC report has estimated that if temperatures were to rise to about 4 degrees Celsius, which we are on course for if we don't do anything, if business as usual continues, it's likely to cost the global economy about $23 trillion a year. And in India specifically, if temperatures rise even a little bit further, it's likely to have an impact on GDP anywhere between 3 and 10%. And the biggest challenge here is that climate change starts by impacting the most vulnerable communities. So it is the rural communities, it is farmers, it is those in the fishing industry. The poorest people are impacted the first and the most heavily. And they form the backbone of our economy. So we really do need to start thinking about how we can address climate change and quickly. And then finally, of course, World Economic Forum has also recognized that climate change is one of the most important risks impacting or on the world economy at the moment. So given all of this that's happening around climate change, the positive side is that businesses and companies and economies are starting to shift towards low carbon. There are organizations around the world that are, measuring their impact. Over 650 major companies around the world currently disclose their carbon footprint and have some sort of carbon targets in place. And this is something that's now beginning to really pick up steam in India as well. And therefore, there really does need to be movement amongst businesses in India, driven by policy, driven by education, to start integrating climate change into your business strategy. So the best way to start doing that, and the first step to looking at how you impact climate change and how climate change impacts you, is to measure your carbon footprint. And this is, again, linking back to what SEBI has now introduced in the BRSR, which is understanding what your GHG inventory or your carbon footprint is, and what are all of the different activities within your operations that are leading to it. As management students, and I'm sure there's a few of you in here, a lot of you know that the famous saying, what gets measured gets managed. And this has been said in so many different ways. Lord Turner, who was with the UK Financial Services Authority, said the first step towards managing carbon emissions is to measure them, because in business, what gets measured gets managed. And Bill Gates said he's been struck again and again by how important measurement is to improving the human condition. We need to know where we're starting so that we can plan where we're going, and how we can reduce our emissions. So that's what I'm really here to talk about today. It's about how businesses can start measuring their carbon footprints. And it seems to be a daunting task to a lot of people, because this is the first time for a lot of businesses to start doing this. And it's not something that is part of their core competency. So everyone's looking for guidance. So I'm hoping I can give you a good introduction into how one can go around measuring carbon footprints. So to start with, there are many different ways in which a company or an organization or even a city can measure its carbon footprint. And to sort of standardize that so that we have comparative carbon footprint, so that, my company or company X can measure their carbon footprint and compare it to company Y and see how we're performing. There are several global standards and protocols that one can use. There are standards and protocols that you can use if you want to measure your carbon footprint at an organizational level. And then there are also carbon footprints and standards that you can use if you want to measure the carbon emissions of a product or of a specific project, or life cycle emissions, for example. The most commonly used standard, and I've listed some of these here, but the most commonly used standard amongst most companies today is the corporate accounting standard published by the GHG protocol. And that's the standard that CERE as well uses when we work with companies to help them assess their carbon footprint. The GHG protocol, the corporate accounting standard by the GHG protocol, has been published by WRI and WBCSD, which is the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. And it covers 6 different greenhouse gases, specifically the 6 that I mentioned at the start of the talk. And today, 9 out of 10, so 90% of Fortune 500 companies are using this protocol to assess their GHG emissions. So if this is something that you are interested in taking forward, I think this is an excellent starting point. You should visit the GHG protocol website and read the accounting standard for yourself to really get an idea of how one goes about assessing carbon footprints. But today I will give you a short summary of that standard and hopefully take you through the processes and steps that you need to undertake. So measuring an inventory or measuring a carbon footprint is, in a way, it sort of follows steps that any other kind of measurement would do. You need to first define a boundary, so define what entity you're measuring for. You then need to collect the data, and then you need to analyze that data. And I'm going to break that down into some steps for you. So the very first step is, of course, setting up your organizational boundary. It's to understand what it is defines your company. And this can be especially complicated for large multinationals or large corporations or group companies where you have several entities. How do you know where one company ends and the other one starts? So it's very, very important to start your project by start your assessment by setting up that boundary. So this is the company that I am measuring the footprint for. The next step is to set up an operational boundary, and that is to identify all of the activities that are going on within that organizational boundary that you had set up. So identify activities that could potentially lead to greenhouse gas emissions. Once you've done that, you identify the activities. So yeah, once you've done that, you identify the activities that are specifically leading to greenhouse gas emissions, or also potentially sinks or absorbing greenhouse gases or storing greenhouse gases. And then you collect data about those activities. And that data is what we call activity data, essentially. Once you have activity data, you develop a methodology in terms of how to convert that activity data into emissions. And then you finally calculate the GHG emissions, including removals, if there are any. So I will go through these steps in a few more details. So starting with organizational boundaries. So GHG protocol basically asks companies to use one of 3 approaches when determining their organizational boundary. One is an equity share approach. So you basically define the boundary as A company accounts for GHG emissions from operations according to its share of equity in that operation. And the other is a control approach where you're looking at whether a company, you're looking to account for emissions from operations over which a company has either financial control or operational control. Now, again, financial control is financial control over assets. So you have the ability to direct how those assets may be bought, sold, invested, etc. And operational control would imply that you have control over the day-to-day operations of those assets. And for me, the easiest way to sort of distinguish between that is to give you an example about leased versus owned buildings. So were you to take a financial control approach, then maybe leased operations would be outside of your boundary. But if you would take an operational control approach, then leased assets or leased spaces would be within your organizational boundary. And the one that we recommend that companies take, which is the most comprehensive approach, is the operational control approach. It's also the approach for which you are most likely to get the largest amount of data. The next step is to identify the operational boundary, or to identify all of the different sources of emissions that you would need to account for coming from your activities within that organizational boundary. Here also, the GHG protocol divides emissions into different categories. And there are 3 different categories that you need to look at. The first is scope 1 emissions, or direct emissions. And these are emissions that are coming from directly within your organizational boundary. So for example, if you are a factory and you have a power plant within the factory premises that's using coal, then you would account for the emissions arising from that power plant. If you are a service sector organization, then perhaps you have a fleet of cars that you're operating, then emissions from the tailpipes of those cars, from the combustion of fuel, would come within scope 1 emissions. Another important source of scope 1 emissions is fugitive emissions that are a byproduct of other activities. So maybe you have a chemical process in your plant where one of the byproducts is carbon dioxide or methane, and that goes out through your flue gas or your emissions. That would be a part of scope 1 emissions. Or for example, for service sector companies or offices, and we work with a lot of offices, HVAC systems have coolants in them, which are all HCFCs, like R22 and R410A, and they tend to leak over time. So you need to account for emissions from those leaks because HCFCs are particularly potent greenhouse gases. If you remember from my earlier slide, they're about 1,000 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. So even a small leak is a significant emission. So that's scope 1 or direct emissions. The next scope is scope 2 emissions, which specifically refers to purchased electricity, heat, or steam. So here the emissions are being produced elsewhere. If it's purchased electricity, they're being produced at a power plant somewhere. But since you are the consumer of this electricity, you need to account for it as part of scope 2 emissions. And this one predominantly tends to be one of the larger scopes because this is where most people get their energy from. This is definitely where offices or service sector companies get their energy from. So scope 2 emissions is particularly important. And for factories, you may even be importing heat and steam from other locations. So you would need to account for those as well. Scope 3 are all other indirect emissions. And these are, so anything that's up and down your value chain. So it could include anything from the embedded carbon in raw materials you're using in your manufacturing process, so that the emissions that happened at another factory because of the material that you used, to emissions, business travel and employee commute and logistical services, transportation services, all of these other areas or other aspects of operations that are not within your organizational boundary would lead to scope 3 emissions. since we're talking about businesses, another interesting source of scope 3 emissions that the GRI recognizes is emissions associated with investment portfolios. So what is the emissions associated with the kind of investment you are making? And this is something that a lot of financial companies are now needing to start to consider as part of their scope 3 or indirect emissions as well. So this essentially covers all of the different kind of emissions you need to take. So step 1, define the boundary. Step 2, identify the activities that lead to emissions, categorize them as either scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And then step 4 is collect data on those emission sources. So as I mentioned, you need to collect 3 kinds of data, really. One is the activity data. So for example, if you're consuming electricity, you need to collect data in terms of kWh or units of electricity. If you're engaging in business travel, you need to collect data about sectors that people have traveled, the modes that they've traveled. Is it air? Is it rail? The distances they have traveled, and in some cases, even the class of travel. So for example, travel by air on business class has a much higher footprint than travel by train, in second class. So you really do need to get quite a bit of data. And I think this is one of the areas that companies struggle with the most. And you need to start by putting systems in place to collect this data. And you potentially also need to engage with your different vendors to collect the data from them as well. So activity data is one of the key data points one needs to collect. The second is emission factors. And these are basically factors that convert activity data into emissions. The most common one that I will talk about here is the emission factor for electricity, or for purchased electricity that comes from the grid. The emission factor here is actually published by the government of India, by the Central Electricity Authority every year. You can just go to their website and get it. It's about 0.8 kgs of carbon dioxide per unit of electricity. So if, for example, you are using 1,000 units of electricity, you would multiply by 0.8, you would get 800, and that would be 800 kgs of carbon dioxide would be your footprint from purchased electricity, to give you an example. And then finally, if your emissions are not in carbon dioxide, but they're in another greenhouse gas, like methane or HCFCs, like we talked about, then you would need to multiply by the global warming potential of that gas. Again, global warming potentials are published by IPCC. So you can find these on the IPCC website. And honestly, this is the really straightforward part about greenhouse gas accounting. In that sense, the math is really simple. It's the process that's a little bit involved. You need to understand where emissions are coming from. You need to work on developing those sources of emissions or those inventories. And then you need to identify the right emission factors for the kind of data that you do have available. I did want to mention very briefly, since a lot of people ask me to focus on technology. CRE doesn't use these technologies. I'll be very transparent about that. We help companies do emissions by collecting the data and doing the assessments ourselves. But there are over 60 companies today that offer software that help you do emissions or GG emissions accounting. I have mentioned a few that I am familiar with or that I have heard about here. PE Sophie is one, SAP Carbon Impact is another, Enablon and Envisi by IBM all offer GG accounting software. Before you jump down the technology rabbit hole, though, what I did want to sort of point out is that if you're a company doing this for the first time, just remember that rubbish in is rubbish out. So this technology cannot help you collect or organize your data or identify emission sources. It'll only help you account for it and then maybe do some calculations. So you need to ask yourselves a few things before you go ahead and invest in any kind of software. And that is, do you have the ability to collect and organize primary data? So the data that I have brought up here, for example, liters of fuel consumed, units of electricity, everything. All of that needs to be collected and input into the software. Two, you also need to account for the fact that these softwares can be expensive and they're usually charged per user. So how many users would you need to input that data. If you have a very sort of decentralized data management system, then you may need multiple users and the costs can go up. So look at the different tools available and consider the best option for you. And then finally, you have to have an understanding of your own organizational and operational boundaries. Software cannot help you or technology cannot help you with that. So it's very good to understand those processes internally before you start investing in technologies. Understand what you want to define as your organizational boundary, and also understand what operations lead to greenhouse gases. So that being said, so today there are over 40 countries that have made greenhouse gas reporting mandatory. I've listed some of them here, and we can very proudly now add India to that list. As greenhouse gas accounting and disclosures become mandatory in 2023, is my understanding. And these are some of the points at which greenhouse gas accounting aligns with your ESG or VRSR reporting. In terms of Section A, in terms of general disclosures, if you can report on risks and opportunities associated with climate change as part of your disclosures. And in Section B, both Principle 2 and Principle 6 align with the kind of data that you would gather in terms of greenhouse gas reporting. So there's data on energy, on waste, on scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions, and also some information in terms of greening supply chains, because if you're looking at your scope 3 emissions, which are indirect emissions, you would need to start working with your vendors to understand what emission sources, where your emission sources are coming from, and how green those vendors really are in terms of the kind of products or services that they are supplying you. So there's immense linkages now between the ESG BRSR reporting and GHG accounting. So it's a really important step for companies to start building this capacity, building this capability within their organizations. Very briefly, I also want to mention another very important reporting platform when it comes to GHG accounting, and that is the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is an international platform, a voluntary platform for carbon reporting and carbon disclosures. Over 7,000 companies today report to this platform, and a lot of investors then look at this carbon data. They also do biodiversity and water questionnaires as well, but they look at this data when they're assessing companies in terms of their sustainability performance. So those are sort of the ideas I wanted to introduce when it comes to GHG accounting. These are the steps, the very basic steps that companies need to take and things that they need to think about. I would have loved to talk about it much further, but I only have about half an hour. I briefly want to end with talking a little bit about technology, given the nature of this whole program, and Manthan is about innovation. If we are to tackle climate change, if we do want to address this issue, and we do need to really, and very, very soon, we do need to make some really big changes going forward. And most importantly, we need to decouple carbon emissions from economic growth. I think that's the most important thing. And technology will play an incredibly important role in helping us achieve this. So there's sort of three big steps that I sort of think we need to do as a nation, as individuals, and as businesses as well. One, we need to start transitioning to carbon neutral and circular economy. Our current modes of manufacturing are just not sustainable. They're not long-term. So we do need to transition to a more circular and carbon neutral economy. Two, we really need to start investing in renewable energy and carbon capture projects. And energy transition is an absolute must when it comes to addressing climate change. There's no way around that. There's no technology around that. We just need to invest in renewable energy solutions. And then finally, we do really need to start cooperating with other businesses and with other nations to start securing our collective future. When it comes to technology, there's a sort of a few things I would like to highlight for you. So of course, like I said, we need to invest in renewable energy and we need to invest in carbon capture. we do need this big energy transition, and we need to do it quickly. Renewable energy, and not only do we need to make it, do we need to invest in new technologies, we also need to make these new technologies cheaper. And that's already happening. Wind and solar energy costs have come down wind has come down by 3 times from what it was 10 years ago, and solar is today 10 times cheaper than what it was 10 years ago. So start investing in renewable energy technology. The other really important area that we need to see investments and changes in technology is, of course, batteries. Battery costs have also come down, but we also need to find more sustainable green battery technologies. I've shared a couple of pictures here. The first one is a program that CERE itself does. We have a program called Switch On Solar, in which we use CSR funds from businesses to set up solar rooftop installations on underprivileged schools and hospitals in Maharashtra. So we're really working to build up the solar rooftop capacity of these organizations and make rooftop solar an important part of the solution. And then the other example I want to give here is of a company called Augwind, which we were recently introduced to. It's an Israeli company, but it uses compressed air technology. It has an air battery solution instead of a chemical battery solution. So you can just imagine that has a very light carbon footprint and has a very light environmental footprint. But it uses compressed air essentially to store energy, and that's quite innovative. The other area where we're looking for innovation and technology is constantly changing is, of course, carbon capture and use. The picture here is I'm sharing an image of a plant in Tuticorin that has actually set up one of the first carbon capture and use plants in India. It captures carbon from its power plant and uses the captured carbon to manufacture soda ash or baking soda. And carbon capture technologies now need further investment, and of course are also springing up around the world. And then finally, there's other areas of technology that need support and that need to be pushed through policy and through education, and of course through adoption by businesses. And those are electric cars and a focus on electric mobility and public transport. Simple things really, like better installation. And also even today in 2022, we're still talking about transitioning from CFL to LED. That has not happened, but that simple technology change can have huge consequences in terms of mitigating carbon emissions. And then there's things that are a little bit out there, development of things like artificial meat to help reduce emissions from agriculture. And animal husbandry. And then also, especially in India, there have been huge movements in terms of improving the energy efficiency by looking at technology to help to improve energy efficiency in steel and cement industries is an absolute must. So these are some of the different sort of technology solutions that we need to start focusing on building up. And I really think it's important for big companies to start being the first movers in adopting these new technologies so that brings the cost of that technology down for everybody else, and we can see a sort of broad scale adoption across the country and then even globally as well. I just want to sort of give you some few examples here of organizations and companies doing this around the world. So Germany, of course, plans to phase out coal-fired power plants by 2038. Now, I don't know what's really going to happen with this target given the war that's in Ukraine, but until very recently, this was something that they were planning to do, a transition to 80% of its energy being sourced from renewables. And then Indonesia, which is a company that's in a developing economy, instead is focusing on carbon capture so that it can continue to build its economy on fossil fuels, but also reduce its impact by focusing on carbon capture technology. But technology, and I do want to stress this so importantly towards the end of my talk, we cannot completely rely on technology. It is not the magic solution or answer that we are looking for. We also need to significantly look beyond technology. We need to start looking at how we use resources, start using fewer resources, and being more innovative in how we manufacture goods. So I wanted to share a couple of examples of that with you here as well today. So this is an example of a company called Patagonia. They manufacture clothing and outdoor gear. And they have really looked into how they can make their production cycle more circular. And their goal is to make sure that 90% of the fabrics that they use are recyclable and traceable by the end of this decade, I believe, by 2030. And then another really interesting case study that I wanted to share is a financial solution to climate change, where Seychelles has had an agreement with the US, where they've done something called a debt for nature swap, where they have been forgiven debt in exchange for the creation of a marine protected area to safeguard coral reefs, mangroves, and also to safeguard against overfishing. So technology is incredibly important. GHG accounting is definitely important, so that we need to see where our emissions are coming from and then start targeting those areas. But we also need to expand our mitigation activities beyond technology and look at other innovative ways in which we can start with protecting our natural ecosystems, because they are the best way at the end of the day to become resilient against climate change. And also transition to renewables and move away from economic development that's driven by fossil fuels, essentially. So I want to just end there. I hope I have been on time. I think I've been exactly on time. And again, share some information about CERE. We are an environmental nonprofit, like I said, but we do work in the sustainability space, and we do work with companies to help them do carbon emission assessments and build strategy and policies for mitigation. This is through our Carbon Map and Cap program. And my name is Janjri Jasani. I've shared my email address and my phone number here if you do have any follow-up questions or you want to get in touch with me later. And that's it for me. I think we can open up for Q&A now.
Great. That was such an amazing session, Ms. Janjri, especially a couple of case studies that you talked about, and it was quite insightful. I already have a couple of questions on the Q&A side, but with respect of time, I'll take only the selected few. Let me take this one specific question from Mr. Rakesh. And Mr. Rakesh asks that, have you ever come across carbon neutrality data about a mission mode digital infra, such as income tax or a passport program run by Government of India, and how does the figures look like?
I'm going to give a very brief answer on the question. I have not come across any carbon neutrality data about a mission mode digital infra. I do know that India has set a carbon neutrality target of 2070, and Maharashtra, Mumbai city actually has set a carbon neutrality target of 2050. Mumbai does have a carbon neutrality roadmap, which you can have a look at, where they have 6 different focus areas in terms of how they want to go about reducing their carbon impact. But I haven't heard specifically about what the gentleman was asking about. I'm so sorry.
Okay. No worries. With that, I'll take a quick pause, and I would request all the attendee members to mark the attendance for the first session. In terms of how to mark the attendance, you can either scan this QR code, which is right in front of the screen, or else you can click the link in the chat window that you will see right now. And with that, I'll take one more specific question, which is from Argdeep. And he asked that, can renewable energy completely meet the future power demand, especially in the context of an emerging market like in India?
That is an excellent question. And I will be very frank and say no. Renewable energy cannot meet 100% of our power demands right now. But that doesn't mean to say that we should be investing in right now we need fossil fuels to meet our base load, okay? Because renewable energy, the nature of renewable energy is that it fluctuates. You only have solar power when there's sun, you only have wind power when there's wind. So you do need fossil fuels to meet a base load, and the transition will take time. So immediately, no. If we were to just say, let's turn off all the coal power plants, let's just build a bunch of solar, that's not going to meet our power requirements. We don't have the technology. The grid won't support it. There does need to be a lot of innovation in that space to happen. But long term, yes, absolutely. We do need to start looking at renewable energy accounting for a majority of our power, and then fossil fuels only meeting sort of a base load requirement, and even then curtailing that. So if you see in that earlier statistic that I meant, case study that I mentioned, Germany is committed to 80% of their energy being met by renewables, not 100%. There are countries that are doing 100%. So I think Scotland and New Zealand are targeting 100%, but they have much more reliable. So for example, New Zealand relies on geothermal. That's not going anywhere. It's a consistent supply of renewable energy. We don't have that option here in India. And we also need to see battery and energy storage technologies really improve before we can completely start transitioning to renewables. And we need smart grids as well that can direct the energy to where it's needed as and when it's needed. So lots of things need to happen simultaneously, but the short answer is we can't completely cut off from fossil fuels, though as an environmentalist, that would be my dream. But we do need to start making sure that renewables are the bulk of our energy source and not just where we are today, which is, I think, if you discount large dams, which I personally do, then we're barely at 5% renewables right now.
Right. No, absolutely. That's quite amazing. And it's absolutely, as you mentioned, right? Right now, it may not be possible, but over a future of time, maybe like small steps, consistent steps towards protecting the environment will definitely lead to a larger global impact in creating a more sustainable ecosystems for the world. With that, I would like to thank you for joining us for today's session and move ahead with today's agenda. And with that, I would like to
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending. I do appreciate the time you've taken to hear me out this morning.
Thanks a lot. Thank you so much. And with that, we have an amazing distinguished panelist joining us for the next Fireside Chat on how giving control of data to citizens will unleash the next wave of growth for the securities industry. Our next speaker is well known to you all, and I won't say I would say that he needs no introduction, because it is always a pleasure and an honor to introduce Mr. Nandan Nilekani. Mr. Nandan is the co-founder and the chairman of Infosys Technologies Limited. He was the founding chairman of the UIDAI and was in the rank of the cabinet ministry from 2009 to 2014. Most recently, Mr. Nandan has co-founded and is the chairman of EkStep, a not-for-profit effort to create learner-centric, technology-based platform to improve basic literacy and numeracy for millions of children. Born in Bengaluru, Mr. Nilekani received his bachelor's degree from IIT Bombay. Fortune magazine has conferred him with Asia's Businessman of the Year in 2003. In 2005, he has received the prestigious Joseph Strumpter Prize for Innovative Services in Economics, Science and Politics. In 2006, he was awarded the Padma Bhushan Award. He was also named the Businessman of the Year by Forbes Asia. Times magazine listed him as one of the 100 most influential people in the world in 2006 and 2009. In 2017, he received the Lifetime Achievement Award from EY. He has also authored and co-authored several books like Imagining India, Rebooting India, Realizing a Billion Aspirations, and The Art of Bitfulness, Keeping Calm in the Digital World. Welcome to the forum, Mr. Nandan.
Thank you.
Great. With that, I would like to also formally welcome Mr. Suresh Sethi. Mr. Suresh has over 3 decades of diversified global experience in the financial services industry and works extensively in the financial inclusion space, leveraging fintech and digital-led innovation to make differences. He is currently the Managing Director and CEO of Protean eGov Technologies Limited, formerly NSDL eGovernance Infrastructure. In his last role as a founder and CEO of and MD of India Post Payments Bank, he has established the largest interoperable banking infrastructure for public goods at scale in India. Prior to Indian Post Payments Bank, he has had various roles across various organizations. Primarily, he has led the business strategy for M-Pesa in India as a managing director and CEO for Vodafone M-Pesa. In his earlier assignments, he has worked with leading financial service companies such as Citigroup and Yes Bank across multiple geographies, covering India, Kenya, UK, Argentina, and US. He has held several senior CXO and managing director level positions at regional and global levels. For his contribution to the financial service sector, Mr. Suresh has been recognized by the Asian Banker as part of the Asian Bankers Award and the list of the leading practitioners. He was also recognized as the CEO of the Year, India Post Payments Bank at the India Banking Summit and Awards. With that, I would like to acknowledge the presence of our chairperson of SEBI, Ms. Madhabi Puri Buch as well. Welcome to the forum as well. And with that, I would like to welcome our Mr. Avnish to formally welcome our panelist. Mr. Avnish Pandey is the Chief General Manager of IT and Securities at the Securities and Exchange Board of India. At SEBI, he is responsible for technology oversight of financial markets infrastructure and implementation of SEBI's strategic directions and innovative projects. He has over 31 years of IT experience with 26 plus years of financial markets regulatory experience. I would formally welcome Mr. Avnish Pandey to the forum.
Good morning to our eminent panelists. And on behalf of SEBI, I formally welcome Mr. Nandan Nilekani and Mr. Suresh Sethi, and it's indeed a great honor and privilege to do so. We'll look forward to a very insightful fireside chat, and I'm sure our audiences would find it really stimulating and find good innovative solutions to energize our securities market. With that, over to the eminent panelists for this insightful discussions. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nandan, good morning.
Morning.
Pleasure seeing you again. And Nandan, the topic that we are covering is how giving control of data to citizens will unleash the next wave of growth in the securities industry. Now, looking at the securities industry, when we look at the BFSI sector, the securities industry has been a forerunner in adoption of cutting-edge technology. Right from establishing the Central Securities Depository way back in 1996, the entire industry has been way ahead of the curve in introducing near-time, real-time settlements. And as a result, there are huge customer data pools today sitting in the securities industry, and they're very interestingly pooled across various organizations. So the entire journey has been very different from the payments and the financial industry on the other side. So would like to hear from you, what are these pools of data? What is this technology we are talking about? We'd like to hear your comments on that.
Thank you, Suresh. And I think before I delve into the present, I just want to give a historic backdrop. I see this as the third phase of technology in the securities market and a very exciting phase. The capital markets and the security industry has always been at the forefront of technology automation. The first round of that actually happened in the 90s. And after economic reforms in 1991, one of the major areas of reforms was securities market. It also helped by the fact that there was a very talented pool of top bureaucrats of those days, Mr. G.V. Ramakrishna, D.R. Mehta, R.H. Patil, Chandu Bhave, P.J. Naik, Y.B. Reddy, amazing people at that time. And then, of course, we had the 1992 Harshad Mehta episode. So that led to a big push to reform the capital markets and led to the creation of these great institutions. SEBI was set up in 1992, NEC was set up in 1992, NSDL was set up in 1996, CDSL was set up in 1999. And fundamentally, it was probably the first major national market that was completely automated and dematerialized. So, SEBI and the capital markets have been pioneers. And that was the phase one of what happened in the capital markets. I think the second phase is what's been happening in the last several years. I think one is the compression of settlement. I think SEBI has done an amazing job in notifying T+1 settlement, which is getting rolled out in a big way. India is one of the few global markets which has T+1 settlement, and it has the potential to go to even T+0 or real-time settlements. The second thing has been the integration of digital payments into capital markets. There are two great examples of that. One is the ASBA application on UPI. using UPI. And the reason why that's important is that now, especially with smartphones and all that, people are able to apply for with one click on the phone, they can apply for IPO, they can block money using ASBA, and then the money is debited to the account only when the shares are actually allotted. And I'm told more than half the the IPOs today have ASBA coming through UPI, which is an amazing change in a matter of 3 to 4 years. And that will dramatically accelerate primary market transactions, including the upcoming one with LIC. The other important thing is the changing nature of capital markets. When I remember when the Indian markets began, and at Infosys, we went public in 92, 93. We were among the first companies to do a free pricing IPO. And we also, at the same time, the foreign investors came into India, so Morgan Stanley and others. And for a long time, the foreign investors were the bulwark of the Indian market. And they also benefited from a lot from the value growth that happened. And it was something quite very big that happened. But today, there's been a sea change in the Indian markets, and there are two new sources of capital coming into Indian capital markets. One is, of course, what's coming from pension funds. So people like EPFO are now giving part of their money allowed to invest into ETFs and so on. And the second is the rise of SIPs. And in January alone, SIPs was 11,000 crores. And that means that Indian money is now coming in, both retail money as well as institutional money. And in fact, even though in the last several months, the FII money has been going back, going out of India because of rising interest rates in the US, the markets have not gone down because Indian money is replacing the foreign money in some sense. So this is a big change which is happening. And also, I think the dramatic retailization of the markets with all these devices, with UPI, with demat accounts, digitization. Just to give a sense of what happened between 1992 to say to 2018, we had about 4 crore or 40 million demat accounts. And then in the last 3 years, the number of demat accounts have doubled from 40 million to 85 million, or 4 crores to 8.5 crores. So we see a dramatic expansion. So this is the second phase of technology in capital markets. And now we're entering into a third phase where the account aggregator system, which is getting rolled out, will allow people to leverage their own data in different ways. And this, along with the real-time nature of transactions, the fact that UPI credit will be available and so on, means that we are going to enter a world where we will have population scale participation in capital markets at very high volume, very low cost, very real time. And India's asset map will start shifting from physical assets like real estate and gold to financial assets. So let me just stop here and we can continue.
Nandan, thanks a lot. That was an excellent synopsis on the securities markets and their evolution over the last years. What I would like to now delve into is the main area about data and the use of data. I'm going to quote you. You said that globally, most countries are thinking of data protection. And we are one of the very few countries which have built a data empowerment architecture. As you rightly called out, starting the journey from Aadhaar, the national identity, going on to introducing digital payments, account aggregator is actually the third phase of data and data usage. And it's a first of its kind model, and it turns data on its head because it empowers the people. How do you see that evolving in the securities market today with some of the numbers you called out and the adoption that is happening in this case?
Well, I think the securities market is going to benefit hugely from data empowerment. Data empowerment is a uniquely Indian idea where we believe that unlike in other countries where data is with companies or with governments, in India, data can be in the hands of individuals and businesses. And the data empowerment architecture is something which is used for that. This allows people to get access to the data from multiple sources through a third-party intermediary called as the consent manager. The consent manager, I talk to my consent manager and say, give me my data from this mutual fund or give me my data from this bank account, and I can share that with somebody providing some kind of an application that is there. The account aggregator framework actually has been approved at the level of the FSDC, the Financial Stability Development Council, where all the regulators are there together. And therefore, it's really common across all the regulators. The first use case, of course, is in credit and banking. And as you know, thousands of requests already happening on that. But in the capital markets, also there are going to be many, many applications. And some of them I can't even visualize. I think some great startups will come and provide that capability. But two applications that I can think of account aggregator in capital markets. One is loan against shares, because people will want credit. People will want credit to apply for IPOs. People want to get credit for their existing holding. They'll have to provide the margin money, and then obviously if the stock share prices start falling, then there has to be an automatic sell so that the loan is repaid. That whole infrastructure can be automated in India. And therefore, I think we can create a very, very sophisticated, at the same time, safe loan against shares architecture. The second is in guiding people to personal finance management. And people are going to become more financially literate as they move their assets from physical to financial, and helping them do their planning. In the beginning, they may have more risky assets. Towards the end of their life, they may have more income yielding assets, whatever is the asset portfolio over time. So personal finance management applications will also emerge. So I see data empowerment becoming a very big thing. And I think it, along with all the other dramatic changes happening in the capital markets, as I said, we went to 40 million, demat accounts in 25 years, and then we have gone to 85 million in three to 4 years. So if we continue that trend, as more and more investors come into the markets, I think all these other things will help accelerate that. They get access to loan against shares or personal finance management applications and so on.
And then taking a segue from there, that we see that goes without saying, there's data and data pools getting created, and Indians are going to be data rich, even if they are not economically rich, and that's the direction and the journey we are on. Today, we see data pools lying across multiple sectors. So even if you look at the financial sector, it is not just Reserve Bank of India managing one pool of data as a regulator. SEBI comes in with the entire securities industry's heft. Then we are looking at PFRDA and pension data. We are looking at the insurance data. And I would say we even extend it to other sectors like healthcare and education, where data plays a very important role in empowering the citizens. How do we see that as we go forward? How does the interregulatory alignment happen? And how does AA become a truly multi-sectoral data ecosystem?
Well, first of all, I think in some sense, the foundation for that has been laid, at least in financial services, because the account aggregator network has been notified at the level of the FSDC. So all regulators are, sort of have accepted that this is the framework. And it's absolutely important that these data pools be interoperable, because the consumer must be able to access different digital pools of his own, and then you use that for multiple applications. As you said, I want to get my bank statement, I want to get my mutual fund records, I want to get something else. So I believe that is important. And one thing about the Indian DEPA, or data empowerment architecture, which is based on the AA and having third-party consent managers, is that it can be applied to any industry. So for example, the NHA is working on the Ayushman Bharat Digital Health Mission, and your electronic health record will also use the DEPA infrastructure, so that you can get your health records and take them somewhere else to get a second opinion. And similarly, the whole education infrastructure of degree certificates and skill certificates will also use your DEPA infrastructure. So for example, if you are a taxi, if you drive a taxi on a ride-sharing platform, you can take your data from there with a good track record and get opportunity somewhere else. So I think we're going to see the use of DEPA not only across all the financial services sectors, but also outside that. And that's going to make a huge impact, because Indians are data rich before they're economically rich. That's the fundamental premise, And therefore, if there's a way that we can help Indians leverage their data and become also economically rich and better off, that's really the future. And no other country has even thought about these things.
True, Nandan. And then one of the things we are seeing, and I would again say while we are at the early stages, some of the early use cases have clearly shown today when we look at the data in the account aggregator ecosystem, 99% of the consents today have been for the use of credit or for acquiring or sourcing credit. What other use cases do you see happening which you would encourage the industry to explore as we go into a multi-sectoral sort of data equilibrium?
Well, I think the reason why most of the 99% is credit, because really all the people now participating, whether it's the banks, whether it's the account aggregators, or whether it's the consumers and small businesses, are looking for credit, and that's where the action is. But once the other regulators, particularly SEBI, starts adopting account aggregator, and I'm sure that's something which is on Madhabi's mind, I think that you will see these other kind of applications I talked about, loans against shares or personal wealth management. See, we have to realize that we are a country which is on the verge of a phenomenal transformation of assets. Today, the total capital markets of India are approximately about $3.2 trillion. I know the exact value of Indian capital markets. And the total value of gold assets in India is about 2 trillion. Because Indians love gold, and India is the largest pool of private gold holding in the world. Now, the US was something similar many years back, maybe 20, 30 years back. The value of the US capital markets, the value of US gold holdings would have been comparable. But today, the US capital markets are worth $27 trillion, whereas the gold holdings continue to be, in the sub $5 trillion range. So we can also expect that in the coming years, today the gold is 2 trillion and markets are 3.2 trillion. 10 years from now, gold may still be 2 trillion, but markets will be much more. And younger people are also coming into the markets. And one thing we must also realize is that for millennials, a big competition is crypto. I mean, I think we should not, of course, currently we are in, we don't know exactly what the regulation and laws of crypto are. But today, many young Indians, their first capital market investment is a crypto investment. These guys are going on, Coinbase or FTX abroad, or they're going on Kuber, CoinSwitch Kuber or Wazir or whatever it is. And they're buying some Bitcoin or Ethereum or something like that, right? So and therefore, those people are going to those markets because they are 24/7, real time and instant settlement. So we have no choice, but the mainstream financial markets have to be as efficient, real time, 24/7 as crypto markets if you want to get those guys into the mainstream financial world. So that's another reason why we need to make these capital markets much more real time, 24/7, instant settlement, low transaction cost, and so on.
Sure, Nandan. Nandan, a very vested question I would ask over here, that it's early days for the AA players, and to really invest in customer acquisition at scale and to take it to the last mile and get as many people who are desiring credit to be part of it, there will be a requirement that there's a lot of investment and a lot of hand-holding to be done. So what are your thoughts on the business models for AAs today?
Well, I think there is going to be, it's again going to be high volume, low cost transaction fee model. If you are going to service 1 billion Indians, it has to be very high volume. It is better to make a small amount of money on a large number of customers and a large number of transactions than a lot of money on a few transactions. So I think the big shift is going to be towards this high volume, low cost, low value transaction model. And the same thing will apply to AA. And I think this also means, see, one thing that has happened is the capital markets essentially got their backend infrastructure in place, right? So we have the dematerialized accounts in NSDL and CDSL. We have electronic trading. We have the exchanges that are the NSE and BSE. We have, we have the electronic discount brokers. You have the traditional ones like ICICI Direct and others, and your new ones like Zerodha and Grow and all these guys. And effectively, trading on cash has gone to zero cost. So many of the exchanges, the brokers are offering zero cost trading for cash and only charging a flat fee for derivatives. So all this is in place to increase the markets. And I also see a lot of startup activity happening here, because once all these things are in place, then we are going to see enormous startup activity, because they know how to get consumers, they know how to create a consumerization experience which can reach out to all the countries. We are going to get more and more Indian language interfaces. So some guy sitting in Bihar can trade entirely in Hindi and so on. So we're going to see a lot of that. All that is going to drive. I mean, a good example is there's going to be a shift from gold to financial assets. And now there are many companies coming forth like Rupeek and all that who are offering completely automated gold ATMs where you can deposit your gold and convert that into a financial asset without meeting a human being. So I think startups are going to do some innovative stuff that will expand the market. I see a huge boom in the capital markets driven by domestic capital, domestic innovation, and real-time, high-volume population scale systems.
And then actually that was going to be my next question. You partly addressed it, but you're absolutely right that as we go forward, the startup ecosystem has a very strong role to play over here, because as these, I would say, digital rails get created and gives the startup industry to participate. We've seen something very similar happening in the payments industry. On top of UPI, various business models, various startups have contributed. What would be, I would still seek more thoughts from you in terms of what problems or solutions should the startup world be looking at solving in this entire ecosystem of account aggregator?
Well, first of all, it's about access, right? We have, if you look at the newer brokerage guys like Zerodha, Grow, and all that, they have basically brought in a whole new set of customers into the capital markets. That's one of the reasons why your retail base is so high. And because your SIPs are at $11,000 crores per month, because you have brought in retail payments, and they'll implement SIP auto pay and all that. So it's really getting more and more people. See, we have to get millions of Indians into markets, because finally for Indians, savings will happen because of compounding in capital markets. Savings will not happen through keeping gold or something like that. They'll really have to, at least a part of the savings. Obviously, you have to think about. So wealth creation has to benefit every Indian, and they can do that. They can offer much better products for financial literacy. They can offer much better products for credit for people who own shares. I think, frankly, my own experience in the startup world is I keep meeting companies who are doing things I could never imagine, and that to me is the thing. We are all limited by our own experience and imagination, but some young lady out there will come up with some application which I didn't even think of. I'll say, wow, these people have thought about stuff I have not thought about. I think that's going to be the big thing. But we have to enable this by having ubiquitous access, low cost, API-based things at real time. Then the market innovation will take over.
I agree, Nandan, and I think I would also add to that today there is a lot of AI business models which are coming in the space of especially the securities market,
sure,
where we are doing a lot of predictive modeling and analysis. I think that would again be a very important part, even if it is for credit upliftment and scoring. Some of these models will get very much embedded in what the startup ecosystem can solve for.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's very important. If you're going to have hundreds of millions of Indians participating, we have to give them a fair market. We have to get them a liquid market. We have to make sure there's no fraud. We have to make sure that the corporate governance is the highest caliber of companies, because these are the savings of millions of Indians. So clearly, all that also has to happen, and technology will play a big role. And I know that SEBI and Madhabi are looking at how to use technology in all these things.
Thank you, Nandan. That was very, very illuminating. We got a lot of information both on the securities markets and the history of it. I would pass it on to the SEBI administrator to tell us if there are any questions that you would like us to answer or that you would like Nandan to answer.
Great. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for those amazing insights around capital markets and the phase-wise shift which the overall capital markets has been gone through. With that, I would like to sorry. Sorry. With that, I would like to formally welcome our SEBI chairperson, Ms. Madhabi Puri Buch, to the virtual stage to express a few words of gratitude. Ms. Madhabi Puri Buch took charge as the chairperson for the SEBI in Mumbai on March 2nd, 2022. Ms. Buch has served as a whole-time member SEBI till October 4th to 2021, and she has also served as a consultant to the New Development Bank in Shanghai. She has also served as a head of the Singapore office in the private equity firm Greater Pacific Capital, and also has been the managing director and the chief executive officer at the ICICI Securities Limited, and as executive director on the board of ICICI Bank. Ms. Buch also served as a non-executive director on the boards of various other companies. She holds an MBA from an Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and is a graduate in mathematics from St. Stephen's College in New Delhi. Welcome to the forum.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that session. Thank you so much, Nandan and Suresh. Of course, Nandan is very familiar with my passion for data. So anything that has to do with data has my vote right away. And yes, Nandan, happy to share that SEBI indeed will be joining the entire account aggregator system.
Oh, fantastic.
Yes. This is something that we are, now at the implementation stage where we are exchanging data formats and API formats for our market participants. So the entire trading system, depository system, as well as the entire mutual fund system will soon be online in the aggregator system. So
Fantastic.
More power to data.
Very good.
I would like to, I usually get asked a lot about the markets, but this is my opportunity to share my thoughts on innovation and on data. So I'm going to take this opportunity to share 3 thoughts with you. The first is really about innovation and how I look at innovation. There is a lot of achievements that people do through innovation and through creativity. They build businesses, they create value for consumers. As Nandan has completely transformed the landscape of India through his creativity and innovation. But behind it all, I do believe that if you don't have fun doing it, I'm not sure that the payoff at an individual level is really there. And I'm sure that people like Nandan, when they were on their journey, and sometimes those journeys are tough, at the end of the day, a lot is created, a lot is achieved, but along the way, I'm sure that people like him have had tremendous amount of fun doing what they are doing. And to me, that is an even richer reward than making billions of dollars, which of course, incidentally, Nandan also made, but that's incident. So this is, one thought I want to share with a lot of youngsters. Do what you do because it's exciting. Do what you do because you enjoy it. Because at the end of the day, you're going to devote, a very large part of your life, of your waking hours to what you do. And if you don't have fun along the way, it isn't worth it, actually. The second thought that I would like to share is really about how very often it is assumed that, creativity and innovation is only about the big bang changes. Now, while that is true, there is a lot of fun along the way that you can have through little things that you do. And I must say my own sense of fun over the last almost 30 years of my career has been in the little ones. I have not created anything which is earth-shattering, but I've had a lot of fun along the way because, little things, little steps, which seemingly at that time look quite insignificant. In my view, they all add up and they also give that everyday feeling of going back home and when your head hits the pillow to say that I enjoyed today because I did something a little bit better and a little bit newer. The last thought I want to share with you is, of course, about data, because that is my passion. And I would say to all the young people here that this is my belief. And I want to share a very, very short story with you A few months ago, I met a young gentleman, who had joined his father in what was a somewhat traditional business. And they used to look at assisting people in doing GST and filings. And this young gentleman said, let me see what I can do with the data. And he said that I started to analyze GST and data. And I looked at him and I'm like, there is no GST and data in public domain. What do you analyze? And he says, no, for every company, there are 2 dates that are available. And I'm like, dates? He says, yes. Every month, there is a filing that the company does where they upload the data, just the data related to their GST and filings related to revenues, purchases, sales, purchases, etc. Okay, it's just a filing, data filing. The second date relates to the date when they actually make the GST and payment to the exchequer, and they upload the receipt of the fact that they have paid. So he says the data shows that most people are extremely prompt in uploading the first filing, because that's just data. You don't actually have to pay anything. But there are a large number of companies who start showing a pattern of delay in the second filing, which means they are delaying statutory payments. He said he analyzed that data of that delay in filing the second filing and developed a predictive model of which company is likely to default on its loans, because if it is delaying statutory payments, it means he has a cash problem and he is at high risk of defaulting on his loans. That's the manifestation of the data smoke. It was just 2 dates. I mean, I could not have imagined that you could do what you could do with 2 dates. But that was the smoke, and he built a fire out of it. And he now has the top banks of the country as his clients who use his analysis in order to really check the credit worthiness of their clients. Now, with greater and greater data of GSTN becoming available, and perhaps in the future, perhaps even becoming a part of the account aggregator kind of system, who knows, we can all hope. Just imagine what these 2, father and son, can do about it. So it's just a short story to tell you that even with a little, you can do a lot. And as far as SEBI is concerned and the markets are concerned, we have taken a very conscious and public decision to say that all data which is market-related data, which is in the public domain on account of regulatory mandate, and that's a ton of data, has to be accessible free, not just to investors, but to people who can download it, access it, add value to it, and make a business of it. Now, you can imagine that there was a lot of resistance to this. So the people who are the gatekeepers to this data obviously were keen to keep that value to themselves. And SEBI took a very firm stance that if you do not do that, because this data is available to you only because we have mandated it as a regulator, if you don't do it, very soon we'll just take it off your websites and we'll keep it only on the SEBI website. And then, of course, we'll give it away free. So as you can imagine, that changed the minds of lots of people very rapidly. But here is the proposal to each one of you who's listening, that market data is available to you in a completely easy to use way, including archived data, which is available to you free. Nobody can ask you to pay for a jot of it, even if you are using it for commercial purposes, because that is the objective of SEBI, that data should be a public good. It should be available freely and free. And then that's the smoke on which we hope that a lot of young people build their business fires. And of course, I see that Sharad has joined us. So I would only like to acknowledge that people like Sharad and Pramod, who sit on our advisory committees in SEBI, give us a lot of food for thought. They help us to articulate this kind of a thinking, first of all, to think about it and then to articulate it, So as SEBI moves towards greater and greater data empowerment and data democratization, I would like to acknowledge the contribution of people like Nandan, Sharad, and Pramod, who guide us on our journey. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madhabi.
Thank you, Madhabi.
Okay. Thank you so much to all the distinguished guests. With that, I have a couple of questions at my side from the audience members, but with respect to the time, I'll take only one or two of them. I'll let me read out the question to Mr. Nandan. With advocacy underway to include numerous other verticals such as GST, PF, NPS, utilities, telecom, tax, among others, do you believe we have the right regulatory model in place to govern new types of FIPs with the RBI as the lead regulator? How could we accelerate the inter-regulatory alignment as the account aggregator becomes truly multi-sectorial in a data ecosystem?
Well, I think already account aggregator is multi-sectoral. As Chairman Madhabi just said, SEBI is fully aligned on the account aggregator framework. And the account aggregator framework is made available at the level of the FSDC, which is all the financial regulators. The 5 of them come together there. And I'm sure government will bring all the other regulators on the same board. What we have found is when you have a technology-enabled system, the moment people sign up for that, then automatically it's taken care of because the data formats and standards are the same. For example, tomorrow, if TRAI says that mobile consumption data, like mobile payment consumption data is on AA, then millions of people who are doing prepaid accounts will get access to credit because of the record of buying talk time. So I think you will see this happening, and each time you add a new piece of data to the puzzle. So you add GST and suddenly 11 million businesses will be able to participate in credit. The moment you add telecom consumption data, then another few 100 million Indians who use mobile phones, their data comes on the system. Each of these things will have a step function. And I'm quite convinced that everybody will recognize that the value is all of us coming together. So I don't see any challenges at all on the interregulatory issues.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you so much for those amazing thoughts. And as you mentioned, like with a overall framework being created as an regulatory free itself. So I think that we don't as well see that sort of a challenge. With that, I would like to formally thank Mr. Nandan, Mr. Suresh, Ms. Madhabi, as well as Mr. Avnish for joining us today, and move ahead with the agenda. Before that, I would like to quickly share my screen so that the audience members can quickly mark their attendance, so that the reason they are marking this attendance is we can issue a digital certificates which they can share across all the digital channels from their side. So all audience members can quickly scan this QR code, or else click the link in the chat window below and quickly fill out the details there. With that, I'll move ahead with the agenda and welcome our third speaker for today, Mr. Sharad Sharma, to talk about the next decade, which will witness the higher economic impact of digital data. Mr. Sharad is the co-founder of iSPIRT Foundation. Sharad's mantra is to lead ecosystems and companies through orbit change. He has 3 decades of experience in the internet, enterprise software, digital finance, and digital health sectors, and is a prominent voice in the India's technology ecosystem. Sharad is a passionate evangelist of a software product ecosystem in India. He co-founded iSPIRT Foundation, a not-for-profit technology think tank devoted to making India a product nation. Earlier, he chaired NASSCOM Product Forum, and is in the formative years, he was a member of the NASSCOM Executive Council from 2009 to 2013. Sharad also co-founded Teltier Technologies, a wireless infrastructure startup now part of Cisco, and is an active technology angel investor with over 24 investments. He was also instrumental in the success of India's first IP-focused fund, India Innovation Fund. Sharad has also led several executive positions with companies like Yahoo, Veritas, Symantec, Lucent Technologies, and AT&T. Sharad is also a member of the National Startup Advisory Council and SEBI's Financial Regulatory Technology Committee. He has also served as RBI's UK Sinha MSME Committee and the National Digital Payments Committee as well. With that, I would like to formally welcome Mr. Sharad to talk about the next decade, which will witness the higher economic impact of digital data. Welcome to the forum, Mr. Sharad.
Thank you so much. Following Nandan, Suresh and Madhabi ma'am is hard. So it's a hard act to follow. But, I'll try and keep it interesting. I don't have any slides. I want to share with you a little bit of the backstory of where we have come from, right? And why are we where we are today? Because this is really going to help us understand what will manifest in the future. So I want to take you to Italy, in Florence. And if you go there as a tourist, one of the touristy things you can do is to visit these banks that have been in continuous operation for 400 years. In fact, bank is Italian word for bench. And so, you as a tourist, you can go and see some of these banks for 400 years. They've been in continuous operation. And when you go there, you learn that there is a difference between what happened in banking in the first 250 years and the subsequent 150 years. It's only the last 150 years there has been this golden rule of banking. What is golden rule of banking? Golden rule of banking is that if the bank has to send my money to somebody else, then they need my permission before they can do that. Now, we are so accustomed to this being the rule everywhere in the world that we think this was there all along. And the fact of the matter is that it hasn't been there all along. For the first 250 years, it wasn't. It was terms of service of the bank. If the bank wanted to follow the rule, they would have terms of service and they would apply that rule. But there was no law that mandated it to happen. So if I owed you money and you were really friends with my banker, you could, take the money from my account, and maybe I couldn't do anything about it at that time. So this is a big shift that happened, right? And the first point that I want to make to you is that this is the big shift that is happening for data. We are living through this 10-year period where the golden rule of data sharing is coming. And the golden rule of data sharing is really very simple. If you have my data as a custodian of my data, possibly because you provided some service to me, and so digital trails are with you, you cannot share my data with anybody else without my permission. It's a very simple rule. India is one of the countries that has embraced this rule at a national scale more vigorously than most other players. The other place where this rule is being applied, the concept has been accepted is EU, and therefore it manifests there as GDPR. So I'll come to GDPR also in a minute. So the first point that I wanted to make is that there is this golden rule of data that has emerged. The second, I wanted to tell you a little bit of story going back to payments, because again, I will draw an analogy between what's happening with payments and what's happening with data. So let's look at payments for a minute. Actually, let's go back. What is payments? Payments is moving money. The thing that we are most familiar with is actually moving our email messages. So let's go back even further and say, how do our email messages go from one place to another? Now, I'm going to basically, in a way, tell you how old I am, because I finished my engineering in 86, but along the way, in 84, I got involved in this kernel system, and what had happened was that Unix had been given away by AT&T Bell Labs, who subsequently became my employer. But at that time, that wasn't the case. I was just a student, and I got interested in this new thing that was coming, which was Unix kernel. And if you and me and a few others all happened to be working on Unix, we had availability of email, and that was called Unix Mail. It used to work more or less the same way as you do now. The email address used to look different, but it worked like a charm. So it was what you would describe as a single party system. So if you, me, and others were on Unix, we could exchange email with each other across the globe. But if you happen to be at that time on a digital machine, PDP-11s used to be very common, or an IBM machine, they were very popular, then we couldn't exchange mail at all. So a group of techies got together, volunteers, in an organization called Internet Engineering Task Force. And they said, "Arey, this problem has to be solved." And they solved it by putting in the middle a protocol. And so instead of putting a company in the middle, instead of putting a platform in the middle, they merely put a protocol in the middle. All of you probably are familiar with that protocol. It is called SMTP, Simple Message Transfer Protocol. Every email that is sent in the world uses that protocol right now, right? So what that did was it allowed email to go from a single party system to a multi-party system. Now, let me come to payments. In payments, before we get to UPI, UPI came out in 2016. So let's go back in time to 2015 or early part of 2016. Every payment system in the world was a single party system. So if I have a Visa card, I can swipe it on a Visa POS machine. The same is the case with Alipay. This is the same with WeChat Pay. The same is the case with Venmo. All the payments in the payment systems in the world were actually single party systems. There were no multi-party systems at all. And this is very, very surprising. And, I'll tell you why is this surprising. And I know all of you are online, so you can do this for me. If you humor me, and while I'm talking, do a quick search for yourself. And the search is put in something called HTTP as the first search term, 402 as the second search term, status code as your third and the fourth search term. You will see what comes up. All of you are familiar with 404 error, but you mustn't have seen the 402 error because it's never implemented. But it was meant to be implemented. Back in the conception of the internet, the idea was that if you had good content or a video or any type of stuff that you wanted me to view, you could either offer it free, or you could take a micropayment for it, or you could offer it on subscription. And if that micropayment failed or that subscription payment failed, then you would get a 402 error. All of us have experienced 404 error. So, it will come up in the same way. So the conception of the internet by Tim Berners-Lee, by W3C, this was, if many of you may know that internet was conceived in the web, as we know, was conceived in Europe. Their conception was that people will pay as they go along. But ironically, this multi-party payment system never emerged. And if truth be told, it happened for, reasons that many people don't talk about. And those reasons are that an alternative view took place, and that many people call it the original sin of the internet. What is the original sin of the internet? That you actually can consume all that content through the advertising model, right? And so advertising model took root, and those early companies that were doing that, Overture, I ended up working with one of them called Yahoo, but Google, what they did was they worked very hard to not let that micropayment service network actually come up, right? Because it was very similar behavior. If you're familiar, if you ask yourself the question, why do many of the American cities, the US cities, don't have good public transport? And if you go deeper, you will find that in the early days, the car companies acquired those public transport setups, those nascent setups, and ripped them out because they thought they'll sell more cars. So in the same way, the early digital advertising companies thwarted the emergence of this micropayment multi-party network, right? And so this continued. in all the way in 90s, 2000s, and somewhere around 2013, 14, a group of misfits who are volunteers with iSPIRT said, we should probably change this. And why were we changing this? We were changing this for a street vendor persona that we have, who we call as Rajini. And we had actually gone to the debit card companies and said, hey, we want to spend 400 rupees to Rajini as a loan in the morning, take it back in the evening. We can't pay 1% on the way out, 1% on the way in. Can we do it cheaper? And they said, yes, you can do it cheaper. We will let you do it at half the price. So which was still 1% a day, right? And we said, no, this is not workable. And so we asked ourselves, how hard can it be to solve this problem? And what emerged from that is what you see today is UPI. And that is the world's first multi-party payment protocol. And now I'm very happy to say that it is the fastest growing payment network in the world. And it's pretty large. We will do more UPI payments today than China, South Korea, and US put together. And PhonePe, in terms of number of transactions, it has smaller market share than Alipay, which, as you know, is a dominant company in China, and yet will do more transactions than Alipay will do in China. So the world has changed in 5 years. It's not taken very long for that to happen. But from that, I wanted to introduce the second concept to you, that sometimes the best systems are the ones which really enable multi-party systems to come about. And they don't put an entity in the middle, but they put a protocol in the middle, right? And so when it came to data, it was very easy for India to now say, hey, India can be one of the first countries to embrace this golden rule of data. Second, do it by putting a multi-party protocol in the middle. And that multi-party protocol is called DEPA, Data Empowerment and Protection Architecture. And it has two manifestations. One manifestation is the account aggregator, which Nandan and Suresh talked about. And I joined a little late, but I heard from WhatsApp that a momentous announcement was made by Chairperson Madhabi ma'am that SEBI will be wholeheartedly joining the AA system. So one manifestation of DEPA is financial data and how it will flow with consent in the system. And the second manifestation in India is health data, and that is called personal health records. That's also been announced by the Prime Minister about in August of last year, and it's rolling out very, very strongly. And if we do get the personal data protection bill, embedded in that current draft of the bill is the same system will apply to all sectors, right? So this is really the second point that I wanted to make, is that the India data system is really about a protocol in the middle. The third thing that I wanted to point out is that when you have a multi-party system, like you have now for UPI and for the account aggregator, what becomes possible is that you can have specialization. So let me first explain to you how this has happened in UPI, and then I will explain to you what is going to happen in data. And I'm hoping, since all of us are familiar with UPI, we will be able to see the parallels between the two. So remember, let's go back to payments for a minute again. There is this golden rule of banking that thou shall not debit my account without my permission, right? This is the 150-year-old rule. And so now what this meant was that the custodian of my money, the bank, would ask for my permission. So till UPI came along, that is the way the system would work. So if you had a bank account in India or anywhere in the world, if I had it in the US with, let's say, Wells Fargo, then Wells Fargo will ask me to give them the permission to debit my account and send my money to somebody else. How will I give them permission? The same way I would do in India, through the checkbook or through their website or through their app, right? But the custodian of the money would basically collect the permission. and then the money would move. We asked ourselves a question in 2014 when UPI was being designed. Why does it have to be like that? Can we not unbundle the role of a permission collector from the role of the custodian of money? So today, when you use Phone Pay or Google Pay or Bheem, money doesn't flow through those systems. They're just consent collectors. And by virtue of being just consent collectors doing that job, they focus on giving you the best possible experience of consent collection. All that they are doing is taking a digitally signed, non-repudiable consent from you, which is when you use their app, and send it to the custodian of your bank, which then says, hey, I didn't collect consent, but I know this is Sharad's consent, and this is digitally signed, and it is non-repudiable. So I will put it in my records and send the money or debit Sharad's account and send the money to whoever he wants to send, right? So this is how UPI works, and it works at reasonable scale, right? We do fair amount of transactions, as I just mentioned to you a little while back. So this is a very, very operational system. So when you think of account aggregator, the same thing happens. In account aggregator, the permission collector is different from the custodian of your money. So the custodian of your money is your financial information provider, who has got to send this to the financial information user. And the only way that data can be sent is if a permission was given, and that permission is given to the consent collector. That consent collector is a licensed entity, and it is called the account aggregator. So why has it been done this way? This has been done this way because we want to make sure that there is no over consenting that happens. So if you had the FIP itself also playing the role of a consent collector, so they have an incentive to say, Arey, Sharad, give me a broad consent so that I don't have to bother you again and again. And what that means is I am now incented to give them a very broad consent, and I've essentially lost control of what happens to my data, because now that I've given a consent, this data is going everywhere, right? So in the context of the AA model, it was decided that we will be better served if the consent collectors' incentives were different from that of the FIP and the FIU. So that is how the system has emerged. So I wanted to mention that to you, so that as you think about participating in the system, you can A, appreciate that there'll be trust, B, you can appreciate that if you are a user, you shall remain in control, C, that it is something, by careful design of the ecosystem, you have better alignment of incentives. Now, I must tell you, where did this idea of having an independent consent collector as a fiduciary come from? It came from the securities market. And in SEBI, for the last many years, has been on a mission of basically equipping many of the mutual fund holders to be able to have a choice between either buying their mutual fund through a distributor or being able to buy it from a registered investment advisor, right? And you end up spending more or less the same amount of money in getting into a fund, but the incentives are better aligned in the RIA model, right? Because you are paying the RIA. The RIA is therefore more obliged to give you advice that is favorable to you. In the distributor model, RIA is really an agent of the manufacturer, may say they're doing it in your interest, but there are other factors at work. So our inspiration has come essentially from the RIA push of SEBI that has been very successful, and I believe that I think by at least for the institutional investors, most of this happens through the RIA model, a majority of this happens through the RIA model. So these are three concepts that I wanted to leave behind with you as you think about data in India. Now, by approaching it in this way, India has become the epicenter, not only for payments, friction-free payments, but also for data. And since 2nd September, when Account Aggregator was actually launched, its growth has been substantial. I think there are subsequent sessions that will be taken up by Sahamati, where they'll share those numbers with you. I don't want to steal their thunder. And but the numbers are extraordinarily good, right? And the trend line is very healthy, and it's a pull-based adoption that is already happening. But India stands out across the world for this. So you can either have, the India model, which allows for innovation and privacy, right? So you get protection and innovation in the same package. They are not in conflict with each other. But if you go to Europe, you get a lot of protection, privacy, but you don't get innovation because the GDPR model is not designed in the same way. And we are quite sure that in the coming year or coming years, Europe will adopt the DEPA protocol as we go forward. And there is a lot of interest on their part to do that. And therefore, our DEPA protocol, India's DEPA protocol, may well become one of the first protocols to go global. There is an interest from other parts of the world as well. We have interest from Australia, from Japan. We have interest from Africa, Rwanda particularly, that is there. And sooner or later, we'll have interest from the US, because US, remember, became wedded to a different model. And that different model was advertising-led. And so therefore, they created a whole data economy, which sometimes is called the surveillance capital economy. And so they have, they have a little bit of unwinding to do. And so they may not be early adopters of this as we go forward. So this is really what is happening in that respect. Now, I'm going to introduce one more concept to you, and then open it up for questions. The concept that I want to introduce is the concept of openness. So let me see if I can share with you what that means, right? And it is just a concept which takes the RIA idea, the Registered Investment Advisor, a little further. So what is the RIA? It says it matters, if you're dealing with an intermediary, it matters who pays that intermediary, right? And if that payment system is not aligned, then we can have what are called as rogue intermediaries. And those rogue intermediaries become a problem, right? And then the regulator works very hard to control those rogue intermediaries. And it's very hard to do that because they have a very strong business incentive to outwit the regulator. And so this cat and mouse game keeps playing, and usually the outcomes are not very nice. So let me give you one example of a misaligned set of incentives where this happens. You have corporate bonds that are rated by the seller of the bonds, while the corporate bond rater is supposed to be working for the buyer of the bonds, right? And so in some ways, you could say that the 2008 crisis that we had was a failure of rating of those bonds back in the US, especially the real estate bonds. And, why? Because there was a misalignment in incentives. But let me point out that there are many other places where this is not a problem. For example, in the early days, in 1958, to be more precise, US adopted a system where online travel agents, Sabre was coming online, and they said, hey, if you are an agent, a travel agent, then, you have a choice of taking money from the airline and taking money from the traveler. You make up your mind which one you want to do, because you can't take money from both. If you take money from both, then you work from neither, right? So believe it or not, if you go in India also to Make My Trip or Yatra or any of these travel agents, online travel agents, Clear Trip, and book your ticket, you will pay a convenience fee to them, and they will not get any money from the airline. because the rule is that any airline, so let's say tomorrow there was a new airline flying from Bangalore to Bombay, and as long as they complied with the tech rules of integrating themselves with the GDSs, which therefore mean that they have integrated themselves to the online travel agents, as long as they've complied with the technology rules, then Make My Trip is obliged, is required to show me that flight when I put in and say, please show me flights from Bangalore to Delhi. And ultimately, then I will pick, whether I want to travel by that or not. So therefore, this new airline that has come up says, hey, why should I pay anything special to Make My Trip? Because whether I pay them or you don't pay them, they have to show my flight as an option as we go forward, right? So therefore, by carefully thinking about what business model that you attach to these intermediaries, you can actually get a better system. That better system in India is been there for cable television. It is there for OTAs. It is there for registered investment advisors. It is there for what is called as net neutrality for ISPs. You remember some years back, I will tell you this story. You will probably enjoy it. That there was this company from the US, which, in the US, there was net neutrality, but they decided to have a program called Free Basics, and they rolled it out into 26 countries. They came to the 27th here in India. Here there was an uproar because it did not comply with this net neutrality open principle that I'm talking about. And a Save the Internet campaign started. Many of us were involved in that. And we had a very thoughtful regulator on the other side in TRAI at that time, Mr. R.S. Sharma. And that resulted in a very progressive net neutrality policy called a 3-page policy. Now, the interesting story is that then a few years later, there was a change in the US and a new president came, about 5.5, 6 years ago. And that president appointed a new leader of FCC who then said, this net neutrality policy is not a good thing. And the same company in Silicon Valley who had forced us to come up with this well-written 3-page policy now had to file a lawsuit in the US to protect their own net neutrality, right? And if you go and look at that case, the second attachment is the prominent second attachment in their case is this India's net neutrality policy, which they define in their case as the gold standard for the rest of the world. And so they were forced to defend their old home, where with the same policy that India ended up embracing, because of their antics, because of their duality. They said, there's one thing for us at home and another thing for all these countries outside the US, right? So openness in ISPs has been ingrained in our network. Now what is happening is that this is moving its way beyond, as I would say, from payments, from data that I talk to you. It is also moving into areas like lending. So it's called the Open Credit Enablement Network. It's come to health. It used to be called Open Health Services Network, but the new name of that is called UHI, Unified Health Interface. And it is coming to digital commerce, as you may have heard in the papers yesterday, as ONDC, Open Digital Commerce, Open Network for Digital Commerce. So what India is doing is taking the original idea of the internet, which was that it should be open, it should have protocols in the middle, and bringing it to life at a scale that no other country in the world is doing. So therefore, there is a shift that is taking place. Now, why is this important for all of you? Why am I giving you this long story? Because I am giving you this long story because all of you, I am hoping, will vigorously embrace this. Because as India becomes the epicenter for going back to the basics, for the new internet that will emerge from India is the internet that will go to the West, to at least the democracies in the West. As that happens, it will take many of our Indian companies global alongside. I have witnessed this. I used to be in the telecom space. My Teltier was a telecom startup which was acquired by Cisco. And I witnessed this firsthand. When GSM, which came in Scandinavia, in Sweden and Norway and Finland and all of these countries, when GSM went global, their companies went global. Even today, the largest telecom equipment provider is Swedish, Ericsson. And you all know at one time, the largest mobile phone provider was Nokia, right? So my hope is that you can see this big picture that is emerging. And in this big picture that is emerging, you are able to embrace this for India in a big way. And when you do that, I am very confident that in times to come, as this model of India travels to the rest of the world, many of you will have opportunity to become the Nokias and the Ericssons of tomorrow, who will take these ideas to the rest of the world. So this is really what I wanted to share with you. And I'm going to now open it up. We have 10 minutes left, and I love to open it up for questions. And I would be open to any kind of questions that you have. So over to all of you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Sharad, for those amazing stories that you shared. With that, I actually have a couple of questions on my side. And however, I would like to take a specific question by a gentleman that I know. But before that, I'll quickly take a question by Mr. Rakesh, who asked that what's likely to come after UPI. So we have already seen a phase-wise manner change within the digital payments infrastructure in India from a IMPS, NEFT evolution to BBPS as well as like now coming in with the UPI infrastructure and UPI 2.0 frameworks as well, which has been come up. What are your thoughts around the UPI and what next after that?
So something has already come, and that is called e-rupee. E-rupee is a value-added service on UPI. There's another value-added service that is used by SEBI very effectively. SEBI took a very bold decision of letting IPOs happen on UPI, right? And that's been, I don't know what is the percentage of applications on IPOs that is now going through UPI, but it's a win-win for every party concerned, right? And many of you may be already familiar with that. So that's been a very big value-added service on UPI. There is another big value-added service on UPI that is coming, and that's called e-rupee. What it does is that it allows people to, companies and governments, to be able to issue a voucher, e-voucher, that is person-specific and purpose-specific. And so it will have a fair amount of use cases as we go forward. Now, it will lead to revolution on the DBT side, for sure. So, for example, when we have about 25 million babies that are born every year, and some of the babies are underweight. And so if they're underweight, then what happens under the Poshan Abhiyan, the mother gets, let's say, protein biscuits, right? Now, in some states, the mother indeed gets the protein biscuits. But as you can imagine, in other states, only the register says that the mother gets protein biscuits, and actually nothing is given to the mother. So in these kind of situations, the government is in a position to now give her an e-voucher so that she can go to any pharmacy and buy those protein biscuits herself, right? Because she's got the money to be able to do that. And she won't be able to buy something else because it's purpose specific and it's person specific, but it'll work anywhere and everywhere where UPI is accepted. So over time, this will bring a lot of reform, supply side reform on the DBT side, but it has also got lots of use cases. For example, if you offer an annual health checkup to your employees, you can give them an e-voucher and then they can redeem it wherever they like, right? So things like that. So that is really where the big news about UPI is coming. But the data thing, DAPA and data are actually cousins of UPI, as I was trying to tell you. They are based on very similar principles, same golden rule of sharing, same concept of protocol, and the concept of specialist players coming in to bring the experience to life. And so the question that you can ask me is, which cousin will be bigger 10 years from now, right? Will UPI do more transactions on a single day 10 years from now? Or will the DAPA, the account aggregator, PHR, all of this will do more transactions 10 years from now? I can tell you what I believe. It is going to be the DAPA, which will do more transactions. And there's a very simple reason for it. And that is that, if I have money in my bank, I can only send it once to you, right? But if I have data, I can send it many times because I want loan from 5 people. I'll share it 5 times, to be able to obtain. So our belief is that the number of data sharing transactions in the economy will exceed the number of money sharing transactions in the economy, but not in the short term. But if you look at 10 years, that would be the case as we go forward.
Right. Those were like really amazing points that you shared. And again, as you mentioned, even it's a quite close competition around account aggregator frameworks leading the transactions throughout the next decade, or the UPI framework. With that, I'd like to take another question by Mr. Avnish Pandey, who is the Chief General Manager at SEBI. I would like to hand over the mic to Mr. Avnish and let him speak.
So we have just discussed a very interesting concepts on the protocol, specifically the DAPA protocol, which is going to become kind of a de facto standards when we start sharing information. So, sir, my query is somewhere around in those lines. So when we are talking about various transactions, various kind of data which is going to emerge and flow within the securities market. So there are 3 things that comes to my mind. And first is definitely a protocol which is going to be a generic protocol for collecting data. So we know about DAPA. We also know about something like XBRL, which was a generic protocol for sharing the financial information. And then there are going to be protocol in which we are now going to take the trading data and stuff like that. So there are a lot of protocols. So that's the first question. What is your kind of thought process that do we need something which is a generic protocol, or is it going to be a segment-specific protocol, so a purpose-built protocol? So that's one question. Second is, so whenever we are getting this kind of data, people tend to process it, and there is a lot of analytics. So analytics has become kind of a buzzword which everybody uses and process. So what is your take that over a period of time, there would be a framework put in place, or there would be an emergence of a processing language itself? So for example, we have Pythons, we have Julia. So where is the direction that is going to take, where easy processing, which can be done by people at all these levels, you don't require a high-end skilled programmers to do that. So that's second question on processing of data. And so the third question which I have in mind is, once I have processed a particular data, I need to put up those results for consumption of others. So what would be the standards that would get developed, that once I have a particular structure defined based on certain standard and I push it to a website, it automatically gets published in the desired fashion, and we don't have to do too much of tagging. So today we have some XBRL based standards. So what is your take? How is all this going to emerge and facilitate usage and consumption of data in a longer run?
Very, very interesting questions. I'll answer all of them. First is that there is in account aggregator a concept of FI types. So which means that the payload that is moved from one place to another, which is FIP to FIU, that payload must have a standard, right? That payload standard is, of course, very, very sector specific, right? So So a payload standard for a health claims, will be described differently, let's say from a payload standard for a bank statement or for a mutual fund statement, right? So that payload standard is extensible, and current standards that you have, they will just get folded into the account aggregator system. What the account aggregator system does is to give you the rails for that consented flow of data should happen. So it does not the payload standards are extensible. You can add them and the regulators can add them as they go along, but the underlying protocol remains same. So across sectors, the underlying protocol. So for example, the electronic data consent standard is a national standard, and it is multi-sectoral in nature. And similarly, the protocol that mediates the movement of data from the data provider to data consumer, or FIP to FIU, or HIP to HIU, that is also common, but the payload types will vary. So that is the answer to the first question. The second is, I was not planning to cover this, but I will mention it since you asked. We have only so far seen the phase 1 of DEPA come out. So let me explain what is coming later this year by December, which is phase 2 of DEPA. So phase 1 of DEPA is called the inference cycle. So inference cycle is that I want the doctor to infer what is wrong with me. So I want to give as much data as I can, relevant data as I can, health data, to the doctor. And I do this using the PHR system. I want the lender to give me the loan at the cheapest rate. So it's in my interest to give that lender whatever data I think will help my case. And so I give that lender as much data as I want to, so that the lender can infer, what my risk is and give me a loan. So this is called the inference cycle. This is what is already out there. This is what we have talked about. But over time, what will happen is that this doctor or lender will most likely start using a model to interpret the data that they are receiving, right? And so if I'm a doctor and I see 100 patients, or I have a practice of 300 patients, or if I am part of a hospital that is a practice of 30,000 patients, why should I train this model only using those 300 or 30,000 patient data? Why should I not be able to train my model using all the other data that is available? But the question is, how can I do this without sacrificing privacy? So India is going to introduce a very important way of being able to do that, where instead of training data going from one place to the modeler will come to where the data is. And it will be done in a secure way, and it's called the confidential clean room. And India is at the leading edge of trying out confidential clean room at scale. And it is happening in the banks as we speak today, and in the health area. And so what will happen is that the people who want to train models, their models will get certified so that they are not going to leak personal data. So this is going to be a rigorous differential privacy certification, but it's going to be automatic. Software will certify other software. And so it will happen very quickly. And so if you have a certified model, then that will travel from one lender to another. It's called federated learning, or from one doctor to another, and using federated learning, so that you can still have the benefit of ecosystem-wide lending or ecosystem-wide training for health or data, and you have the best models in the world. Now, this is very, very important, because our goal is to make India the epicenter of the best models in the world. We don't want that tomorrow our underwriting models or our health models, diagnosis models are coming from the outside. We think this data economy that is being created in India will create the Airbus and the Microsoft of these industries, and they will again travel to the rest of the world as we go forward. So that kind of answers your second question. The third question that you said was, when you have done your work with that data and you have inferred something, what do you do with it, right? And so that is sector specific kind of an implementation. Lending will be different from securities, and it will be different from health, which in turn will be different from other areas. And that's a longer discussion. Perhaps we can take it up in an upcoming May 7th session that Sahamati will do.
Right. Thank you so much for those amazing insights. I actually already have a couple of questions on my side, but there is this one specific interesting question by Mr. Timanna, where we are already talking about a lot of emerging technologies, playing an important role in data, as well as like innovations within capital and the securities market. So Timanna asked that how does Web3 fit into all of these together? To take, for example, DigiLocker, UPI, e-voucher, Open, ONDC, UHI to the world. Now that IFSC has already opened up building the global fintech hub in India, what's your take about like emerging technologies like Web3 playing a role in all of these?
So Web3 became important because so what happened was, because of the original sin that took place, then we created these, we have a $400 billion digital advertising industry in the world, of which $210 billion is Google, $150 billion is Facebook, $30 billion is Amazon. Amazon is a big player in advertising, and the rest of it is in the noise, right? So this $400 billion is surveillance capital, because they, to be able to operate effectively, they suck in as much data as they can from us. So Web3 is an attempt to fight back and saying we must have decentralized web. What does decentralized web means? That instead of having these powerful companies in the middle, let us have a protocol in the middle. What is the example of that? The SMTP example that I gave. When we exchange email with each other, we don't have an intermediary in the middle. We have a protocol in the middle, right? When we exchange money, we don't have an intermediary in the middle. We have protocol in the middle. So this protocol in the middle is an idea that India is applying to more sectors than anybody else in the world today. So therefore, one of the four horsemen of Web3, and many of you who are in this space will know him. His name is Balaji Srinivasan. And who is he? He is the co-founder and the founding CTO of Coinbase, the largest company. Then he went on to become a general partner at Anderson Horowitz. He's very well known. I would encourage you to listen, see what he tweets about India. And his view is that India is at the cusp, at the cutting edge of this more than anybody else. So really, why we don't call India a Web3 player, and I want to explain that also, is that Web3 is actually going back to the foundational principles. But going back to the foundational principles where these underlying protocols were actually owned as public good. So SMTP is not owned by any company. It is not owned by any state. It is a public good, which is a global public good, right? And so, but when Web3 is being talked about, these protocols are not necessarily being conceived as public good, because the Web3 conversation is being done entirely by private parties, right? And so their hidden agenda, we don't know for sure. So our way of explaining this to the world is that by going back to the principle of open protocols, open networks, India is actually implementing the idea behind Web3 better than what Web3 itself is talking about, which is also an idea about open protocols and open networks, except in India, this is being done as a jugalbandi between public goods and private innovation. But we don't know whether that will necessarily be the case with Web3 as we go forward. So I hope that answers the question with respect to Web3.
Right. Absolutely. Those were quite fascinating insights that you provided. And especially like when we talk about like open protocols, I think like the overall concept of innovation being like converted from a closed innovation to an open innovation models itself, that itself leads to the next generational growth towards businesses, towards startups, towards the economy. With that, I will like to take one more specific question, where the participant asked that how do you foresee the direction of RegTech and SupTech? Like RegTech means regulatory technologies and SupTech means supervisory technology in India, focused around data democratization. Would you tie this with interest for the entities whose data is being shared so that they are aware of misuse of the data? What's your take around this?
Look, first, I have to say that we have to change our view of the regulators. I think this revolution that we are seeing, whether it's in the space of KYC or identity, or in the space of payments and now data, and similarly lending and other RIA that we talked about, is all coming because the regulators are active participants in this. Right? You think UPI would have come about without the regulator having the conviction, to create a new type of a payment system that does not exist anywhere else in the world, right? And so it required, RBI to take leadership in making that happen, right? Account aggregator, as Nandan pointed out, is owned by FSDC, which is all the financial regulators coming together. So sometimes we need the white man to tell us we are doing well. And when the white man doesn't say we are doing well, then we believe we are not doing well. I would suggest to you, right? And this is something you can please go back and look. And I'll tell you the backstory of this, that in July of 2019, so one in banking, for example, RBI is part of something called Bank of International Settlements, which is called the central bank to central bank, right? And it's a very powerful institution. In July of 2019, a new, back in time, at around that time, a new general manager, a new head of Bank of International Settlements had taken over. His name is Augustine Carsten. Now, he's very well known. He's a macroeconomist from University of Chicago. And sometimes when people talk about potential Nobel Prize winners, his name is cited, right? So he's a very accomplished person. He had gone on to become the head of central bank in Mexico, did very well, became a well-known, well-regarded finance minister of Mexico. And then he was put as the head of Bank of International Settlements. So once he became the head of Bank of International Settlements, he was visiting all the countries. And obviously India was one of the countries. And so somebody in Chicago told him that if you're going to India, make sure you fully understand what is happening in India. And he ended up in his 3-day visit coming to Bangalore for his first 1.5 days. And because he came from a developing country, became a convert. And on September 9th, 2019, they hosted a meeting for all central banks, all their central bank members, and a single agenda meeting, which is about the financial services architecture of India. For the first time in 16 years, it was a single agenda meeting. 16 years, they had never had a meeting focused on one item. And then you can go back and see, it is out in the public on December 15th, 2019, they issued a paper, which essentially says, in their recommendation, this is a generational shift that has happened in thinking about regulatory architecture for financial services, and their opinion, the whole world should adopt it. Right? So I would suggest to you, right, if you have a sense whether or not our regulators are cutting edge, because they are embracing these ideas, right? Today you heard about SEBI's embrace of AA. And so our regulators are at the cutting edge. And this revolution would not be happening without them. So there are buzzwords that everybody talks about. There are unsolved problems that everybody talks about. But I want to balance them out by pointing out to some really wonderful stuff that has been happening on the regulatory side, which has been instrumental, critical, central to the revolution that is taking place. And that is making India, as people say, the fintech capital of the world, right? So keep that in mind. Go back and read the BI's paper. Have belief in our regulators. They are progressive, they are forward-looking, and they will help unleash this new revolution in a controlled way, that is going to be a win-win for everybody concerned.
Absolutely, and I guess like that was really fascinating, and it's always an amazing case study for an Indian regulators that we see that there is always a right balance between security, between investors protection or consumer protection, along with adopting emerging technologies for an innovation standpoint as well, so that the overall ecosystem keeps on growing and we progress more faster compared to our partners or like other countries next to us as well. So that it's quite fascinating that you mentioned about those stories. With that, I would like to conclude the session, and I'd like to thank you, Mr. Sharad, for joining us today, as well as all our previous distinguished speakers for joining us today. I'll briefly take 2 minutes to talk once again about the Manthan Ideathon program that we are running. So, as I mentioned, SEBI launched this program earlier this year with the larger agenda of promoting innovation within the capital markets. And when I say innovation within the capital markets, it's about where exactly are your ideas can foster change across these 4 themes. Number 1 being investor education, protection, and ease of investing. Second being securities market development. The third being market regulation, and the fourth being integration within the financial ecosystem. So SEBI, in association with BSE, NSE, NSDL, CDSL, K Fintech, CAMS, Lincoln Time, MCX, and NCDX, launched this program to promote this change within the capital markets. And when it comes to what's in it for participants, there are prizes, prize money up to worth 5 lakhs up for grab, including selected exclusive goodies for the participants, as well as participation certificates as well to all the people who submit their applications. In terms of the timelines, we are right now very close towards the close of the program, and we have already received 1900 plus registrations for this program. So make sure you are going in and finishing your application and submitting your ideas. We would like to know your ideas which talks about capital markets innovation and securities market innovation within this for this program. In terms of who should apply or who would be the right audience to apply, if you think your idea can make a change within the capital markets across and irrespective of wherever you are a startup, a finance enthusiast, a management candidate, professional, or a student, we would like to know and we would like to hear from you. And with that, I would like to briefly open up the final the form for the attendance for this last session that we conducted. You can also submit your briefly register with the link in the chat window, or else you can scan the QR code which is there right in front of the screen. I'll take a pause for 2 minutes for the audience members to scan this form and mark their attendance. Just to reiterate what I already mentioned earlier, the people who are marking this attendance, you will receive an automated emailer from the organizing team in terms of for the participation for these masterclass. But make sure you're going in and submitting your applications for the Manthan Ideathon program on manthan.devfolio.com. The link for it which is already in the chat window below. With that, I would like to formally conclude the third masterclass as well. Make sure you are also attending the next masterclass, which is conducted the next Saturday. I would like to thank all the participants, all the attendees members for joining us on a Saturday morning and spending a beautiful evening and understanding about account aggregator frameworks, about data sharing, data privacy, climate change, and the business's responsibility. And I would like to formally thank all the speakers for joining us and supporting us for this program, and all the partners as well for supporting the Manthan Ideathon program. Thanks a lot.